All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming today. And I just want to say right off the bat, thank you guys for putting this presentation together. It is a blessing to have a group of pastors and ministers like you guys in this area who see the importance and the relevance of these issues. So I really do appreciate you guys putting this together. We are going to go through a lot of information today, okay? So bear with me. Am I able to advance my slides? While he's doing that, I will just mention that we have several resources on the table for you. One of them is a sheet of paper that you're going to see a giant QRL code. If you guys have your phones and you're interested, you can scan that and it will take you directly to our website. And you can actually download a copy of the slides from today along with our handout of resources that we offer along with these presentations. And I will be talking about that and what those resources are in just a little bit. Awesome, perfect. So that's the QRL code that's over on the table that you guys can take a look at if you're interested. So what we're going to cover today, we are going to cover 4 different sessions. So the first session is understanding gender ideology. And I'm going to go through a few different questions with you and answer those questions for you. In session 2, we're going to look at parenting and protecting, and we'll separate that into 2 different sections. The first one will be the indoctrination of children, and the second one will be then how do we protect children. The third session, we're going to cover parent and child rights. We'll look at an overview of court cases in that session, and then in the final session, we'll talk about schools and school boards. All right, so let's jump into the first session. So those 4 questions that we're going to look at in this portion are: what is gender ideology? Are children being taught this ideology? Is it a valid set of beliefs? And what is an alternative view? So first of all, what is gender ideology? Well, gender ideology is a set of beliefs. Okay? It's a set of beliefs, it's a worldview, and in particular, it's about gender. So the first thing that you have to understand is that this set of beliefs is claiming that gender is a social construct. So what that means is that your gender and your biological sex are no longer synonymous. Okay? Your biological sex is evident in your physical body, whereas your gender is the way that you see yourself fitting into society. So for example, you may have a male who has a male body, but their concept of themselves is a feminine being within society. So then you have a guy who is identifying as a female within society, okay? Sometimes a person's gender and biological sex align with one another, and that's what's being called cisgender. Okay? But otherwise, they are now 2 different concepts according to this belief system. Along with this, they believe that gender is subjective. Okay? So what this means is that it's a person's internal understanding of who they are, their preferences, and how they feel. That's what determines their gender. It is also believed that gender is a spectrum. So whereas in biology, we typically have male and female, and this is a binary system, the idea now is that, well, male and female are on extremes, and you could be anywhere in between. So you could be a combination of male and female. You might even be both male and female. You might be neither, okay? And we're going to see these concepts too. Gender is also fluid in this belief system. So they believe that your gender can change from day to day, from year to year. It's not something that's fixed. They also believe that your biological sex is assigned at birth, and it can be reassigned. And we're going to talk about that in more detail too as we go along. And then finally, if somebody does have a discomfort with their own biology, the way that this is fixed is by altering that person's body. all right? Now, I know there's a lot here. We're going to go through all of this in more detail so you can start to understand it a little bit more. But the next question we're going to ask is, are children being taught this information? Okay, and the answer is yes, they are being taught in a number of different ways. For example, there are activist teachers in school that are promoting this set of beliefs. For example, in Livingston County near me, Livonia is just a small rural town, and there are activist teachers. For example, a 6th grade math teacher shared transgender videos one day in class instead of teaching math. And parents have also told me about other teachers that are doing the same thing, okay? There are also after-school clubs that are teaching this ideology in a number of ways. So at the Livonia Central School District, again, the GSA clubs posted Transgender Celebration Day posters throughout the school. Many of you may have heard about what goes on in Pittsford. Their Rainbow Club, that's for the elementary students, they read the gay BCs to these kids. All of these things oftentimes are happening without parental notification. And then we also have curriculums. So curriculums are now starting to absorb these ideologies. And I'm not even just talking about health curriculums. For example, the curriculum that I'm about to read to you is Prodigy. It's a math curriculum, okay? This math curriculum says this: a class has 30 students. There are 15 students that identify as non-binary. What is the ratio of non-binary students to other genders? Okay, so this is being incorporated in many different areas. There are also drag shows that are becoming very, very popular. Pittsford has put on some of these drag shows. They are being advertised to children at school as a family event. So kids are learning some of this stuff through those family events as well. And then also children are learning through the books. So Hope in a Box is an organization that donates books nationally, and they donate books that are about these topics, about transgenderism, and they have donated to over 40 schools in New York already, and most of them are right here in upstate New York with us. I think a lot of times we have this concept that like, well, it's just happening in New York City or in the big city schools. It's not, okay? Most of these schools are some of the rural schools and in our areas up here. Now, I forgot to mention on this slide, but another way that children are learning about this information is through websites that are being encouraged as academic, educational information. Amaze.org is one of these websites that is actually used in a lot of curriculums. They'll cite different videos that a child can watch. Some of these videos are teaching children how they can access medical health care, things like hormones and puberty blockers and sex reassignment surgeries, without their parents' knowledge or consent, okay? It literally trains children what kind of questions they should be asking when they're at a doctor's office. Now, what I'd like to do right now is I'm going to actually read to you a number of books that are very popular right now and are in daycares and schools in New York, okay? So I'm going to read these to you, and they will hopefully explain a little bit more about this gender belief system. The first book I'm going to read to you is called Being You. It's meant for pre-K through first grade, so this is when kids are 3 to 6 years old. Now, this book is actually a part of a series of books that is intended to help people have first conversations with little children, okay? And there was an Amazon review that says, warning to parents, daycares and schools are reading this nonsense. That's the reason I reviewed it, okay? So let's see what they are teaching children. Some babies grow into a different gender than the one that grown-ups called them. There are lots of different genders that people grow into. Some people are girls, some people are boys, some people are neither, some people are both. Now, if you think about this, for a child who's 3 years old, this can absolutely confuse a child on gender, cause them to question their own gender, and that could be very scary for a 3-year-old to think, what am I going to grow into? Okay, that's a very confusing concept for a child. This book also says, some bodies have a vagina, some bodies have a penis. Every person's body parts look different, but there are some parts we all have. When a baby is born, grown-ups might say it is a girl if their body has a vagina, or it's a boy if their body has a penis. Sometimes grown-ups aren't sure, but they choose the words girl or boy anyway. What did your grown-ups call you when you were born? So now, not only are they confusing children about their own gender identity, but they're confusing them about what it means to be a boy or a girl. And if you notice the very subtle lesson, the lesson is teaching children that adults are pretty ignorant about this concept of gender. This book also says, for a long time, many people have said and believed untrue things, like you are either a boy or a girl, or boys are stronger and smarter than everybody else. There are lots of unfair rules that give boys more power. And there are 3 children looking at a wall of pictures. All of the pictures are men, and the plaque next to it says, United States presidents. And the question is, have you noticed any unfair rules about gender? Now, here, this is a very, very subtle lesson, but it is teaching children to devalue the difference between men and women. And it also teaches them to undermine the roles of men and women's society as well. The next book I want to read to you is called It Feels Good to Be Yourself. This is for the same age range, 3 to 6 years old. And the Amazon review for this book said, got this book when I was a daycare teacher. The kids loved it, and I loved the message it taught. I highly recommend it. So let's see what they're recommending. This book says, when people guess wrong, it's okay to let them know. Ruthie was 5 when she told her parents, I know you think I'm a boy, but really I feel like a girl. Oops, Ruthie was a girl all along. They just didn't know it at first. So again, we're seeing this theme that parents are ignorant, but now we're seeing this idea that children are the authority of themselves and they have the right to correct adults. This book also says, you might feel like a boy, you might feel like a girl. You might feel like both boy and girl or like neither. You might feel like your gender changes from day to day or from year to year. You might feel that none of these words describes you perfectly. You might not be sure yet. Maybe you're still figuring it out. So this book is teaching children that it is our personal feelings and preferences that create our reality. And not only that, they are also encouraging children that you got to figure this out. And that's a lot of pressure to put on children. This next book is called The GABCs. This is meant for pre-K through 3rd grade, so this is 3 years old to 9 years old. And this book goes through the alphabet, but I'm only going to read a few of the letters to you. B is for bi. You can shout it out loud. I like boys and girls, and that makes me proud. D is for drag. You can strut and dance in clothes that you love, dresses, heels, or pants. T is for trans. It's a brave step to take to live as the gender you know is innate. And with this particular book, you can actually download a PDF online that is meant for parents and educators. And this PDF is full of activities that you can do with young children. One of the activities is called Queer Your Screen Time. And the activity is to have a child sit down in front of a TV show, and for each of the characters within the TV show to identify that character's sexual orientation and their gender identity, and then to have that child choose which of those characters they most identify with themselves, and then to also look at the family structures within the TV show and identify which of those family structures best reflects their family structure. The last book I'm going to read to you is called Who Are You? This is again for that same age range, so 3 to 9 years old. This book says, babies can't talk, so grown-ups make a guess by looking at their bodies. This is the sex assigned to you at birth, male or female. Sometimes people get this confused with gender, but gender is much more than the body you were born with. So again, we see this theme that parents and adults are ignorant. They're explaining a little bit more of kind of that belief system in there as well about what it means to have your sex assigned to you. And it continues by saying, some people say there are only 2 genders, but there are really many genders. You are who you say you are because you know you best. So again, we see this concept of giving children that authority over everything related to themselves. Now, with this particular book comes this wheel that children are allowed to manipulate. And in the center, it says, I have a body that made adults guess that I was a boy or guess that I was a girl. In the center, the next circle, they get to choose their gender identity, and they're given 18 choices, including third gender and bigender and so on and so forth. And then in the outer wheel, they get to choose how they like to express their gender through things like clothing and personal preferences. Now, I want to read to you an Amazon review that was put out by somebody who identifies as LGBTQ. So this individual says, as a member of the LGBT plus community, I am perplexed by this book, The Wheel included. We are taught that we can love whomever, whatever we want, and be what we want. This book teaches children that if they love trucks but are girls, dolls but are boys, that they must be confused on their gender. They're trapped in another body. Why do we need to pressure children to make decisions on who they are so young? College students don't even know what they want as a career going in. And I wholeheartedly agree with this perspective. Okay, so we looked at what is gender ideology, and we went through that it's a belief system, and then we took a look at how children are being taught this belief system. So our next question is it a valid set of beliefs? Okay? And what we're going to be doing is I'm going to share with you 5 principles that Nancy Pearcey laid out in her book, Finding Truth. All right? So I'm going to go through those 5 principles. I have the book over there on the table. Please don't take it. That's my copy, but you're welcome to look through it if you are interested in it for more details. So before we dive into these 5 principles, I want to read to you a quote from Nancy in this book. She says, "Those who reject the Creator will create an idol. They will absolutize some power or element eminent within the cosmos, elevating it into an all-defining principle, a false absolute." So when evaluating a worldview, then, the first step is to identify its idol. What does it set up as a God substitute? Okay? So that is the first principle that we're going to talk about, okay? Principle number 1, what is the God substitute for this belief system that we're looking at? And the answer to that is it's autonomy, okay? John Stonestreet explains autonomy like this. He says, it's the ability to self-determine who we are and how we should live, okay? It's determining who we are and how we should live. That's autonomy. Okay? So keep that in mind as we go along now to the second principle. The second principle is what is devalued, okay? So Nancy, in her book, she explains it this way. She says, idols always lead to a lower view of human life, all right? So if God is not God, but human autonomy is God, that starts to shape the way that we see human beings. Something's going to be devalued. We're going to have our priorities off somehow, okay? So the way that Nancy explains that is, look at what's being devalued. In this belief system, it's pretty obvious. It's our bodies that no longer matter. They become physical material that can be altered at will. You're going to see this in more detail in the second session when I show you the transgender process and the the medical procedures that children go through, okay? You'll understand that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so what's the God substitute? What ends up being devalued? The third principle is, does this belief system reflect reality? All right? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't. And it does this for a number of reasons. The first reason is that autonomy cannot be the ultimate governing force in our world. Okay? I want to read to you again a quote by John Stonestreet. He explains it this way. He says, if we define human rights as something akin to autonomy, that doesn't work in reality. Not only will our respective autonomies inevitably conflict, limiting someone's ability to live what they choose, but will also continue to bump into reality itself, in which there are givens about humanity that we cannot ultimately deny. So I want to explain this a little bit more. Okay, it makes sense that two people with two very different views cannot just create their own reality. They are going to conflict with each other. But at some point, the views and realities that we try to create for ourselves are going to conflict with reality itself. I could stand here before you and say, I identify as a 6-foot-tall Asian man. Okay? That doesn't mean that's reality. We have ways of measuring a person's height. We have ways of identifying race. Okay? There are standards out there in reality that we all understand that are given. And just because I have my own perception of myself doesn't change reality. The second reason to this is that medications and treatments and surgeries cannot change biological reality. So I'm going to show you this really quick. Jeff Myers, who's a PhD, and Brandon Showalter, they have put this out, exposing the gender lie. And this is what they explain in here. They say, biological sex is immutable. Medical interventions, such as blockers, hormones, and surgery, produce grave harm as they attempt to circumvent biology in pursuit of a physical impossibility. Okay? So what they're essentially saying is, as we get into this transgender process, you're going to start to see, okay, what's the medication and what's that process? They're essentially saying it can't do anything. You're trying to change yourself biologically who you are, and that's impossible. There's a number of reasons why this is possible. First of all, men and women are different from each other down to the molecular level. Every single viable cell in your body is either all entirely male or all entirely female. If you think about it, there are so many differences in the ways that men and women even develop. For example, a few years ago when my son was little, he went through some speech therapy. And just in a casual conversation that I had with the therapist, she brought up on her own how, as a therapist, it's so interesting that they actually train boys very differently than they train girls in speech therapy. It's the same thing with doctors. A doctor needs to know what your biological sex is in order to help you, okay, to take care of you health-wise. So this is very important, okay? No matter how much people are trying to change their biology, they cannot do that. If you guys are interested, I will put this over there on the table. There's a link to where you guys can actually download this PDF if you're interested in reading that. Okay, so we looked at principle 1, what's the God substitute? Principle 2, what ends up being devalued through this belief system? And principle 3, does it reflect reality? Principle 4, is that belief system internally consistent? Okay? The answer to this one is no, it is not. Okay? This belief system actually recommends that young children permanently alter their body to align with feelings that can change, that are fluid. Remember, we saw that in the books. And again, this will make more sense as we go through that process in a little bit. Okay? And if you think about it, it makes sense that these belief systems are not going to be internally consistent because they are strongholds that are trying to tear down God's truth. And God's truth is always logical. So that means these strongholds are always going to be illogical. All right, now the final principle that Nancy explains in her book is to offer an alternative view. So that's what I'd like to share with you guys right now, is an alternative view. The Bible teaches us that God created the world perfectly in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And in that, it explains how he created gender as a binary system between males and females. But we also know from the Genesis account, though, that humans rejected God's design, and so things started to fall apart. And that includes our bodies. That includes our minds, okay? We don't function the way that God intended us to do. Okay, so the first thing to understand from a biblical perspective is that gender is an effect of the broken world, okay? It is a mental disorder where a small number of people do not believe that they are their biological sex, but rather that they are the opposite sex. This is called gender identity dysphoria. Gender identity disorder. I have to be very careful. I'm going to talk about dysphoria in a second. It's called gender identity disorder. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 2013 shared a range for about how many individuals may suffer from this. So what this just means for you to understand what's important out of this is that, first of all, it mostly happens in young boys, and the onset of it is early childhood, okay? That's when doctors are most often diagnosing an individual as having gender identity disorder, okay? These individuals who struggle with their gender identity need to be shown compassion and love. But we need to be very careful, and we need to understand that affirming these individuals in their confusion will not help them, because it is a mental disorder. Now, just to give you some reference for understanding this better, there are other disorders that we readily recognize today. For example, anorexia and body dysmorphic disorder. People with anorexia believe that they are overweight even though they are not. And in many cases, they are severely underweight, but it's their perception of themselves that don't fit with reality. It's the same thing that's happening with gender identity disorder. Their perception of themselves doesn't fit with reality. It's the same thing with body dysmorphic disorder. This is where individual parts of a person's body, they might see as just, that's awful, I need that to be altered. Some people do it with their noses and they go in to seek surgery to have it altered. When really, there's nothing wrong with their nose. It's not broken. It functions fine. It's not even, an overly large nose or something. But people have this perception of just a part of their body then. And again, this is a disorder. They mentally have a construct that does not reflect reality. Now, unfortunately, many psychologists are no longer calling this gender identity disorder. They're no longer calling it a disorder. Instead, they're calling it a dysphoria. Dysphoria means a state of unease or generalized dissatisfaction with life. So instead of being encouraged to get counseling to deal with their mental disorder, instead, people are being encouraged to transition to another gender in order to be more satisfied with life. And we're going to talk about that gender transition process in the next session. Next, children can actually struggle with their gender because of trauma. Sexual abuse can lead to gender confusion. For example, young girls that have been sexually abused often believe that if they were a boy, they would not have been abused. Similarly with young boys, oftentimes young boys reject their own genitalia because they are traumatized by the way that they were touched and they never want to be touched that way again. Emotional abuse can also lead to gender confusion. If a child is constantly being told that they are weak or have no value because they are a boy or a girl, or even if they see siblings of the other gender being treated better than them, okay, may try to change their gender in order to either get the affirmation that they feel like they're missing, or because they're trying to avoid the emotional abuse that's coming in their direction that they associate with their gender. Now, I have actually heard stories from individuals who they were not necessarily emotionally abused. They had very loving parents, but their parents would say things like, "Oh, we had always hoped for a boy," and really the child was a girl, or vice versa. And that can stick with a child so young, making them feel like they really weren't wanted or they should have been somebody else. Finally, witnessing abuse can also lead to gender confusion. For example, if you have girls that are watching their mothers being abused physically or emotionally, those girls can develop the perspective then that women are weak and they don't want to be associated with that. The same thing with boys. If they watch men and fathers that are abusive, again, they may reject their gender because they don't want to be like their fathers or like those men. Okay, and then the final category is social contagion. So many of the young adults and children that we're seeing today are actually being confused by what they're learning from culture. Children are being told that if they feel uncomfortable in their bodies, they may be a different gender. Well, if you think about what happens to pretty much every human being in the world, at some point we go through puberty. And what happens during puberty? Well, both boys and girls feel very uncomfortable during puberty. But women especially, as they start to menstruate, they're being told if you feel uncomfortable, you might not be a girl. So what we're actually seeing is that a large number of adolescent girls are now coming out as transgender. The American College Health Association showed that in 2008, 1 in 20,000 female college students identified as transgender, whereas in 2021, 1 in 20 female college students identified as transgender. Okay, so this is huge. A lot of girls are being told if you're uncomfortable, you're probably a boy, and they are switching in droves. Now, studies are also showing that most of the children who come out as transgender are actually a part of peer groups that also tend to mock people who are not LGBTQ identified. So this is the social contagion part of it, where kids are just feeding into each other to follow this concept. Now, if history has taught us anything, it is that in every generation, people feel alienated, misunderstood, or different. So to name a few of those individuals, we have the beatniks, the hippies, the goths, and I'm sure we can come up with a lot more. Today, transgenderism seems to be that label for people who feel alienated. Now, in the past, those other generations, they dealt with their emotions through sex and drugs. What we're seeing with those who identify as transgender is that they're seeking to escape through puberty blockers, hormones, and sex reassignment surgeries. The last thing I want to mention here is about pornography. It is greatly shaping how young men and women see each other. Over 90% of the aggressiveness found in pornography is directed to women and girls. They are often portrayed as weak and secretly wanting to be abused, and girls don't want to be identified that way. So again, this is another push to have them identify as another gender. So from a Christian perspective, gender confusion, no matter why it's happening, is an example of human brokenness, and it needs to be handled very seriously, as this is a condition that produces great stress and tension between a person and reality. Many of these individuals did not ask to have these thoughts and these feelings and these conflicts, and yet they struggle with them because we live in a broken world. At this point, I would like to encourage those who identify as a Christian to understand that in our world today, people are reacting to this in many different ways. One way is that many people are saying, well, I was just born that way. I can't really change, so I'm just going to live with it. The other perspective is, well, I was born that way, and it's normal, and it's fine, and I'm going to celebrate it. We have to be careful because we undermine the cross when we celebrate and normalize our fallen nature, or when we believe that we are too broken to change. Jesus Christ came to this earth to die for us, to make a way that we can have a restored relationship with God, and so that we can be brought back into the way that God intended human beings to live. If we start to celebrate this, or we start to tell people that they can't change, we are undermining the work that Jesus Christ has done. Okay, let's just summarize this session, because there was a lot there. So we talked about what gender identity ideology is, that it's a set of beliefs, it's a worldview. We talked about how children are being taught this set of beliefs through many different outlets, but especially those books. We looked at how gender ideology is not a valid worldview. And we also talked about how the Christian worldview does offer a better explanation of gender confusion.